Branch of service you were in?
Well, I was in the Navy, Naval Aviation, bombardier navigator in the A6 Intruder for the most part. I also flew in the A3. I started in the A3 as a bombardier navigator. I was born August 13th, 1934.
And what years were you active duty?
Uh, I actually enlisted in May of 1958, but I didn't go into active duty until August when I went to OCS,
Which was where?
Newport, Rhode Island.
Okay. I didn't know that. I thought it was Florida.
It used to be, yeah.
Okay. And what theater were you in? What were you in combat?
Oh yeah, it was all Vietnam.
Okay. And your main role while you were in the service was as a BN, right?
Yep.
Can you just say that?
Yeah, I was a bombardier navigator, BN, in A3s and A6s.
Okay. All right, so let's cover a little bit of your background. I just want to ask you where you grew up and maybe describe your childhood, your early childhood. And let's first start with your parents. What were their names? And
My dad was Walford Bean, and my mom, Anna Jane Hole, Hohl Bean. Dad was a mining engineer, and a pretty damn good one. He did a lot of work overseas, down in Bolivia, where I lived the first 4 years of my life, La Paz. And then he was doing consulting work for the U.S. government and sent over to India and Asia to analyze their mines after the war and their mining efforts. And he was published in a lot of different languages and eventually wound up in the Mining Engineer Hall of Fame.
and where was that after Bolivia? They moved to Minnesota, right?
Actually, up to Michigan, where I spent the first 3 years of school, kindergarten through third grade. And then he moved to, during the war, he moved to the iron mines up in Minnesota, where he was superintendent of mines.
And eventually he taught geology
He taught mining engineering. This was another thing about Dad. He never had a postgraduate degree, but he was highly thought of within the industry. And when the Michigan College of Mines, his alma mater, lost his accreditation, they turned to Dad. So he went up there, took over as chairman of the department, and turned the school around and got accredited and got it back up to one of the better mining schools in the country. He was a great man.
Yeah. And so where were your high school years spent? How did you?
High school years were spent in Chisholm, Minnesota, up in the Mesabi Iron Range, about 75 miles north of Duluth.
Okay. And you have a brother and a sister too, right?
I have two brothers and
Oh,
a
two
sister.
brothers.
Yeah, one brother died about 4 years ago. And then I have another brother. Both my brothers were in the Navy. One is in submarines and one was surface. And of course, I was aviation. And Dad, never having been to sea, wondered where in the hell he went wrong. And his sister, or his daughter, my sister, married a marine aviator. So we had quite a nautical family, I guess.
Were you closest children or?
Not really. My younger brother, was 5 years younger. We all got along and still get along very well. But my sister was 12 years younger. My other brother was 11 years younger. So when I was in high school, they were still infants, essentially, but 5, 6 years old.
And then after high school, kind of where did you go after high school?
Oh, well, that summer I spent working as a surveyor assistant, working highway surveys for Minnesota. And then I went to Harvard, and I spent about 8 months there, and I guess I didn't like it. I just didn't fit in. I don't know. but anyway, I dropped out. And then worked in Upper New York State for about 6 months. Went back to school at Carleton. And I'm not really a student. I love to read and everything else, but in those days I just was not oriented towards academics. So I just got up and at the end of my junior year, stuck up my thumb, wound up in Montana doing surveying there, and for oil surveying. And then that contract ran out in January, so I stuck up my thumb and hitchhiked back down to Houston, got a job there with the same company. They sent me to Louisiana, south of New Orleans, in the wild Cajun country down there. It's pretty interesting. And then I went back to Houston, got promoted into an office job, and I was doing office work for about, I guess 4 or 5 months. And I got to thinking about going back to school, and at the same time, the company offered me a hell of a position to go down as a party chief in Cuba. This was pre-Castro days. And it was a hell of a good salary, about $12,000, which is a hell of a lot in those days. Plus all expenses paid, and, I really thought that over. But I had 3 years of college, and I didn't want to really waste that. So I went back to college, got my senior year, graduated in 1958.
So what prompted your move towards service?
Oh, World War II. I, of course, was 7 years old when the U.S. entered the war in 1941. And I was old enough to realize what was going on, and all the movies and everything else. And it seemed like I really wanted to fly. But I was attracted more towards naval aviation than I was to the Air Force. I don't know, it just seemed the thing to do, roaming around on carriers, flying on and off of carriers, getting into exotic foreign lands, plus the fact you had a lot of combat. So I just became enamored of naval aviation and wanted to do that.
But at the time you joined, we weren't engaged in a war.
No.
So you didn't do it to avoid the draft or anything?
Well, not to avoid the draft, because I was drafted, but I enlisted before I opened up my draft notice in the Navy, because everyone had to serve in those days. It was a obligated service of 2 years, and I didn't want to go Army. I wanted to go Navy, so I just went in the Navy and went to flight training, and I just decided on a career. I loved it.
So the jump from college to the Navy, how did that happen?
Well, I had been taking my flight training tests 3 or 4 times. I failed it each time because of an astigmatism in my eyes. And finally, I went up to NAS Minneapolis, and for one last time, and they said, "Look, Mr. Bean, you've been here 4 times, you failed it 4 times. Why don't you just go to OCS to satisfy your obligation and go Black Shoe, or Surface Navy?" So I said, yeah, okay. So I did. I went, and about halfway through OCS, I found out that there was a program for reserves as crewmen in attack aircraft, such as bombardier navigators, okay? So I volunteered for that. They tried to talk me out of it because they said there's no future in it. There is no field as such for careers in the Navy. But I went anyway and became a bombardier navigator and got my wings as such in 1958 or 59 up at Whidbey Island, Washington. And then all of a sudden I passed the test again for flight training, so I got my orders for flight training and went down there, reported in January 4th, 1960. And I got pretty well through the program. I soloed and I was able to do pretty good high work, but I couldn't land I could land on runways, but I couldn't land on precision landing spots. And it was due in good part, I guess, to my astigmatism that I had. So I went back to being a bombardier. Went down to Sanford in 1960, made 2 cruises, and then I also made a cruise on the Independence at Gitmo when doing the Cuban Missile Crisis. And our job, we loaded up with live weapons, and our job was just to fly around the perimeter of Guantanamo Bay. At that time, it was a naval base. And fly around the perimeter, and if they shot at us, we were to drop our bombs on them. Not inside the perimeter, but outside.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to take a short break. I'm going to, and then we'll come back and talk about your service years.
Sure.
Okay.